What family secret was finally spilled in your family? Story 1. My grandma didn't drive. I always thought she couldn't, but it was never discussed. One day when I was around 7 or 8, I kept trying to convince someone, anyone, to drive me to the store for candy. We were visiting my aunt and uncle, and grandma lived with them. The local store sold bit of honey, a candy I couldn't find at home anymore, but no one would take me. Finally, I said I'd just ask grandma, and my cousin chimed in, "Grandma can't drive." "Oh, you bet your sweet self I can drive. They just don't let me." Grandma had overheard, and she was clearly offended. That was the end of the conversation, though. My aunt eventually took me to the store, and I forgot about it. Years later, after I got my driver's license, I asked my mom why grandma didn't drive. She explained that during Prohibition, grandma had been a bootlegger, transporting alcohol for moonshiners. She was incredibly good at it, so good. In fact, that when the moonshiners were caught, even though the authorities never caught her, the state suspended her license indefinitely, never to be reissued. Later, she was told she could petition to get it back, but only if she admitted guilt. Grandma told them to go to hell. Story 2. My aunt wasn't my grandfather's biological child. He met my granny when my aunt was a very sick infant. She had polio and wasn't expected to survive. My granddad married my granny so she could access his insurance and move to an area with proper medical care. My aunt became the first infant to survive open-heart surgery at Yale New Haven Hospital. Although she spent most of her childhood in leg braces, she lived a great, though unfortunately too short life. My granddad loved her as if she were his own, and I never knew she wasn't biologically his until she attended her biological father's funeral when I was a teenager. Story 3. I started having issues with my teeth, spontaneous abscesses that led to multiple root canals. My dentist decided to investigate and discovered some unusual abnormalities with the roots and nerves of my incisors, the teeth causing me all the trouble. He reached out to a couple of professors for guidance. At my next appointment, he was visibly uncomfortable and struggled to explain what he had learned. It turns out my dental issues were a classic sign of inbreeding, and he found it awkward to tell me. When I asked my mom about it, she casually said, "Oh, well, yeah, didn't you know?" Of course I didn't know. Turns out not too far back in our family tree, several relatives thought it was a great idea to marry each other. To make matters worse, the small town where I live is 85% made up of my relatives. No joke. There are so many of them that I haven't even met them all. Story 4. After my mom passed away, I learned the truth about my parents' marriage. She had visited my father's country to see some relatives. After just 1 week of knowing my dad, she asked him to marry her so she could stay in the country. My father agreed because he was alone, and his parents were pressuring him to get married. The surprising part of the story is that over time, they fell deeply in love. Their bond only grew stronger, and they were genuinely happy together. During her final days when she was very ill, she would only allow my father to stay by her side. To this day, he says she was an angel sent by God to take care of him. I was shocked to learn how quickly they had decided to get married, but their love story inspires me. I can only hope to have a marriage as beautiful and loving as theirs. Story 5. My mother had a child when she was a teenager, and she gave him up for adoption to another family. Afterwards, she went to college, earned her degree, married my father, and had my 4 siblings and me. About 30 years after giving her child up, I remember her receiving a phone call and immediately locking herself in her room. I was around 12 at the time. I felt scared because I could hear her crying, but she didn't want to talk to anyone about it. Later that week, my parents gathered all of us kids and shared my mom's story. They explained that my half-brother had reached out, wanting to meet her and get to know her. My dad had known about this since their college days, and my oldest sister had been told earlier. However, the rest of us, and all of my dad's side of the family, grandma, aunts, uncles, etc., had no idea. Coming from a fairly religious and conservative family, it was shocking news at first. Mom flew out with her sisters to meet my half-brother in the state where he lived. Both were nervous, but by the end of the trip, they had begun to rebuild a relationship. Eventually, my siblings and I got to meet him too. Fast forward to now, he's moved to our state, and we see him more often. He's in all of our family pictures, joins us for holidays and birthdays, and is considered part of the family. We're a very close-knit and outgoing family, while he's more reserved, so sometimes he's a bit distant, but we respect his space. Mom stays in close contact with him, and we love when he can join us for family dinners. At the time, I was the youngest and the only boy in the family, so learning I had an older brother was exciting. Now that I'm an adult, I even get some of his old clothes since we're about the same size, and he has great taste, so I lucked out. I'm so glad this family secret came to light, allowing us to welcome my brother into our lives. Story 6. When I was 28, I found out my dad wasn't my biological father. Here's how it happened. My dad was battling depression and experiencing suicidal thoughts, so I flew home to take care of him and try to shield him from my mom's harsh treatment. Throughout their relationship, my mom had been verbally and emotionally abusive. My dad loved her deeply and endured it all. During a quiet walk together, as I tried to support him, he confided in me that he wasn't my biological father. He revealed that my mom had lied to him, trying to convince him he was. He always knew he wasn't, but he chose to step into the role of being my dad. When I was 10 years old, my mom finally admitted the truth to him. He was worried it might affect his relationship with me, but he made sure it didn't. He told me that one of his proudest moments was realizing, as he tucked me in that night, that nothing could ever change how much he loved me or our bond as father and son. During that same conversation, he also shared that my mom had used hard drugs while pregnant with me. It broke his heart to witness, but they were very poor, and life was hard. My dad grew up in foster care without parents. My mom came from a family of 7 children with parents who struggled to provide for them. She dropped out of school in 9th grade, and her siblings dropped out even earlier. Most of them are barely literate. Now, in my mid-30s, I look back on that moment with my dad as a gift. Tragically, he passed away by suicide in March 2020, just as COVID-19 was beginning. I was out of the country but flew back immediately, enduring a 30-hour trip with a short layover just in time for his funeral. Everything I do now is in his honor. He will always be my dad, and I'll forever be grateful for the love and strength he gave me. Story 7. My uncle served in Vietnam. While he was there, his troop found a baby who had either been orphaned or abandoned. They weren't sure which. My uncle was about to ship back to Australia and wanted to adopt the baby, but my aunt said no. They'd only been married for about 4 months when he was drafted, so while I don't agree with her decision and generally don't like her as a person, I can understand her reasoning. My uncle's troop eventually found a family to raise the baby, and that's the story the whole family knows. The secret, however, is that my uncle and a few other guys from his troop stayed in contact with the family and the child. They sent money every month to help raise him, then later to support his university education, and eventually helped him and his adoptive family move to Australia in the late 90s. My aunt and the rest of our family had no idea. It all came to light in 2017 when my aunt and uncle divorced, and she hired a forensic accountant to go through their finances. My aunt had worked at a bank for over 40 years and had always noticed the missing money, but my uncle's explanations had always seemed legitimate. Now that the truth is out, my uncle has introduced some of us to the man and his family. They're all wonderful people. Story 8. I grew up in a Mexican family and have 2 younger cousins. My aunt married another Latino man who looked almost white. Their first child, a girl, looked exactly like her father. No question about it. Their second child, a boy, looked different. He was very dark-skinned. I'm half black, and he was even darker than me. His mom had a darker complexion too, so at the time, no one thought much of it. Fast forward 16 years. By this point, my aunt and uncle were divorced and hated each other. The daughter was always treated like a princess, while the boy was also spoiled but constantly sought his father's approval, which he never seemed to get. One day, the boy's dad had enough and told him outright, "You're not my kid. Your mom cheated, and I don't know who your dad is." He even offered to do a paternity test. The boy's mother never addressed the issue. She ignored it completely, hoping it would go away. We later found out his biological father was Pacific Islander. There was even a family friend who had been a constant presence over the years, but a paternity test ruled him out. To this day, we still don't know who his real father is. His mother claims she doesn't even know. Story 9. When my paternal grandfather passed away, the federal government offered to give him a state funeral. He had been a career Army officer and a colonel, so we didn't think much of it. But when the funeral took place, it was over the top. An elaborate procession with notable attendees, including department heads, senators, retired senators, and representatives from the CIA and State Department. We were completely baffled. It turns out my grandfather had been a significant figure in the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, during World War II. When the OSS split into the CIA and Secret Service, he joined the Secret Service. He wasn't on White House detail but worked covertly in an office focused on counterfeiting and currency. He eventually went blind when I was a toddler and retired, claiming to have been in the army. For reasons unknown, he never shared his covert work with anyone except my grandmother, who was sworn to secrecy. Not even my father knew. He grew up thinking his dad was just a colonel working on a base. After his death, we received a trove of materials, publications, lectures, and other documents detailing his extraordinary career. To me, he was just a blind old man who smoked, drank, and was perpetually grumpy. Turns out he was a true badass and none of us had a clue. Story 10. When my father passed away, I was 17. During the viewing at the funeral home, a young woman showed up with her boyfriend. She looked a couple of years older than me. None of us recognized her, so someone asked why she was there. She said she had come to see her father. My siblings and I were confused, and my mom just stood there, shaking her head. My uncles asked the young woman to leave, and she walked out in tears, supported by her boyfriend. Afterward, my mom took us to a private area and explained that our father had an affair years ago, and the young woman was our half-sister. I never learned her name, and we've never met her since. To this day, it bothers me deeply that she was rejected and denied the chance to grieve at her father's funeral. This happened over 40 years ago, but I still feel like I owe her an apology on behalf of my family. Story 11. My mom cheated on my dad with my now stepfather. My parents divorced when I was very young, around 1 year old, so I don't remember anything about it. When I asked as a curious kid why they split up, both of them told me they just fell out of love. However, I always suspected that wasn't the full story because my grandma once mentioned that the divorce happened in 1996, but my mom and stepfather started dating in 1995. On my 18th birthday, my stepfather privately confessed that they had an affair back then. He admitted he still feels guilty because he believes he broke up our family. I reassured him that it was okay because everyone is happy now, and I had already suspected the truth. Years later, my stepmother told me another part of the story. My mom had kicked my dad out without giving him a reason. She told him she needed a break. At the time, she had a newborn, me, and my dad could barely see me in the beginning. My dad only found out later, through the landlord, that my stepfather had moved into the house he used to rent with my mom, the house where his baby daughter was now living with a stranger. To this day, I don't know how my dad managed to handle that without starting a huge fight. I've never brought it up with my parents. There was one time, though, when my mom started ranting about a neighbor who left her husband for another man. I told her she shouldn't throw stones while living in a glass house. She definitely understood what I meant. Story 12. Everyone knew my great-grandpa had cheated on my great-grandma many times, but we never knew if he had illegitimate children. When my great-grandma passed away, my great-grandpa followed a year later. Their only living child, my great-aunt, was the executor of their estate. While reviewing their documents, she noticed about 20 names listed as specifically excluded from the inheritance. Since the family was wealthy and had taken in foster children when my great-aunt was young, she recognized most of the names. They were foster children who had been deliberately excluded. However, one name stood out. It turned out to be the name of my great-grandpa's son from an affair. After some research, my great-aunt was able to locate his mother and notify her that the son was excluded from the estate. My great-aunt suspected the son didn't know they were half-siblings, and she didn't want to be the one to tell him. She was right. The mother had never told her son. To this day, he still believes his now-deceased stepfather was his biological father. The craziest part? That illegitimate son had 2 daughters who ended up going to high school with my brother. Story 13. My grandfather learned a shocking family secret shortly before his death in 2017. He had always been proud of his middle name, which he was given in honor of his maternal grandfather. He signed his name with his middle initial his entire life. Before he passed, he discovered that his grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, had gone missing for a decade during his life. It turns out he was in prison for raping his daughters, excluding my great-grandmother, the eldest. My great-grandmother knew about it and still gave her father's name to her son, my grandfather. When my grandfather learned the truth, he stopped using his middle initial but didn't get the chance to legally drop his middle name before he died. I had once planned to pass down my grandfather's middle name to one of my children. Now I'm grateful I didn't. My grandfather was a good man, but I have no desire to carry forward any part of that dark legacy. Story 14. When my siblings were little, my parents used to grow weed in the basement. I was either a baby at the time or not yet born. The secret came out years later when my dad sent my sister a photo of her as a child, happily standing in front of a bunch of marijuana plants. She asked him about it in an email, but he ignored the question. He told me all about it, though. Apparently, my dad was between jobs and had visited family in California. One of his relatives was growing weed, so my dad took some cuttings and brought them back to New York. He rigged the electrical wiring to steal power directly from the grid, avoiding a noticeable spike in the utility bill from the grow lights. They grew both marijuana and tomatoes and told the kids everything was tomatoes. My dad sold the weed in bulk to a contact at the local airport where he flew recreationally. He used the money to move the family to a new state and start a business. Story 15. My cousin married her high school boyfriend, and they had 2 children together. It wasn't until the youngest child's high school graduation party that the truth came out. They were actually cousins. The husband was the result of an ongoing affair between a farmer's wife and the farmer's farmhand, who was my great-uncle. On the same side of the family, my grandmother had 14 children from 3 different husbands, or so we thought. It recently came to light that she had 3 additional children who were given up for adoption. One of those children was the result of an affair between my grandmother and the foreman of a lumberjack crew. At the time, she owned a bar where the crew would occasionally come down from up north to drink. Grandma got pregnant and told the foreman during one of his visits. The next time the crew came down, he wasn't with them. They told her he had accidentally fallen into a mill saw and died. In reality, he had a wife and kids. My grandmother quietly went on a vacation, had the baby, and gave her up for adoption. We only found out because one of my aunts took a DNA test. Story 16. My father, who is slowly succumbing to Alzheimer's, has always been considered a hard case by those who knew him in New Zealand. Growing up in the 1990s, I saw that he had many quirks. He had epilepsy, a short temper, and an incredibly literal way of understanding things. He was, in short, a hard man to know. For most of my life, I was told he had suffered severe sunstroke as a child, which caused a significant change in him. Later, another story emerged. He had hit his head hard diving into a swimming pool. The truth only came out a decade ago, after my step-grandmother passed away. My grandfather, deeply affected by his experiences in WW2, had returned from the war an angry man. He married my grandmother, and they raised their family in tough circumstances. My grandmother passed when my dad was 12. As a teenager, my dad's smart mouth pushed my grandfather over the edge. One day, my grandfather snapped and beat him severely, so severely that my dad bled from his ears. That beating likely caused a traumatic brain injury, fundamentally altering his behavior for the rest of his life. Now, we know his behavior is not due to autism or any other condition, but rather the long-term effects of that injury. His entire life was shaped by his father's anger, which in turn was shaped by the trauma of war. I've resolved to break this cycle of anger for my own children and reflect often on how the legacy of WW2 shaped my family's history. Story 17. My great-grandmother co-signed a loan for my parents to buy a mobile home in a nice park where we could live. Unfortunately, my mom was terrible with money, and my dad was too lazy to take charge of the finances. They failed to pay the lot rent, and we lost the mobile home. Because my great-grandmother's name was still on the loan, the finance company started withdrawing money from her bank account to cover the payments on a mobile home we no longer had. A week later, my parents took us to a fair where my uncle confronted them. My great-grandmother had been unable to pay some of her bills because of what my parents had done. I was only 5 years old at the time and had no idea what was going on, but I now realize how much my great-grandmother suffered because of their irresponsibility. I have a relationship with my parents today, but I can't forgive them for what they did to her. My great-grandmother was the kindest, sweetest woman I've ever known. She didn't deserve that. I miss you, Grandma. Story 18. My grandmother on my mom's side got pregnant at 16. She was forced to travel halfway across the country to give birth in secret and return as if nothing had happened. This secret came to light before I was born. Both my grandmother and her 2 other children always wanted to find the sibling, but due to legal barriers, they were unable to. 6 or 7 years ago, my uncle received a phone call from the adopted child, who had decided to search for his biological family after the passing of his adoptive parents. Sadly, his biological mother, my grandmother, had passed away in 2001. Despite this, he has become a welcome member of our family. Before COVID, he would visit annually, but those visits had to stop temporarily due to the pandemic. On my dad's side of the family, a great-great-aunt, my dad's mother's brother's wife, also secretly gave up a child as a teenager. 2 years ago, at my great-great-uncle's birthday party, his wife's adopted child attended. This was news to my dad and me, though the closer family members had known for a while. We're a big and relatively close family, but only see distant relatives on special occasions. Unfortunately, a year later, my great-great-aunt passed away. At her funeral, I noticed her biological children sat up front, while the adopted daughter sat toward the back. She wasn't mentioned in the obituary, which made me feel bad. I don't know the details. Perhaps it was what my great-great-aunt wanted. But I couldn't help but feel that the adopted daughter wanted to be acknowledged as part of the family, especially if she attended birthday parties. Story 19. My mom's mother was actually her grandmother, while her oldest sister was, in fact, her biological mother. Apparently, my mom's biological mom got pregnant at 18, unwed, and her parents decided to cover it up. They sent her away until she gave birth and then pretended the baby was theirs. Her father was a military officer, and this happened in the 1940s, so it was considered deeply shameful at the time. My mom had no idea. The family members who knew never told her, and her birth certificate was falsified. How did this come to light? When I was in 8th grade, I had to do a family history project. My mom called some relatives to help, and one of her older cousins accidentally let something slip. That led my mom to suspect the truth about her birth. She confronted her biological mom, who was deeply upset. Her bio mom had been shamed into silence by her parents, while my mom was raised by people who treated her poorly. She always felt unwanted growing up. Now, my mom feels relieved because her difficult childhood finally makes sense. She and her biological mom were always close, having been raised as sisters. Thankfully, they are on good terms again, and my mom visited her last week. Story 20. We recently discovered that about 40 years ago, my grandfather had a 7-year-long affair with a woman from his church. She was also married. During the affair, they had 2 children together, but they kept it secret. The woman pretended the children were her husband's, even though they looked nothing like him. How we found out was unexpected. A few years ago, I did a 23andMe DNA test to explore my ethnic background. My aunt and uncle had also done the test about a year earlier. One feature of 23andMe is that it shows you DNA matches with relatives. A few days after Christmas, a woman reached out to my aunt and uncle, explaining that 23andMe had identified them as her half-siblings and me as her nephew. Coming from a strict Catholic family, she was understandably confused and concerned. They met to piece together the story and then confronted their parents. At first, my grandparents denied everything, but eventually, they confessed. It's been hard on the family. For a long time, my grandfather refused to apologize to anyone, including my grandmother, for the pain he caused. But he eventually did. Shockingly, despite everything, my grandparents are still together. Story 21. Ever since I was a kid, my grandmother on my mom's side always acted strangely at dinner. If you were looking at a menu, she'd peek over to see what entree you were considering and say, "Wow, that sounds good. Can I split that with you?" It wasn't just entrees. The same thing happened with appetizers, drinks, literally everything. "Hey, want to try my soda?" she'd ask. It always struck me as odd and somewhat annoying, especially since I don't like sharing food. Even stranger, she would watch you eat intently and wouldn't take a bite of her own food until you had swallowed yours. Several years ago, she became estranged from our family for a number of reasons. Gambling, constantly asking for money, harassment, and most notably, her past abuse of my mom when she was growing up. Curious about her odd behavior, I asked my mom why Grandma acted that way during meals. That's when I learned the truth. My grandmother was paranoid about her food being poisoned. She refused to eat or drink until someone else tested it first. Looking back, it's unsettling to think that she might have genuinely believed her food was poisoned and had me test it for her, waiting to see if I'd drop dead or have some kind of reaction. Love you too, Grandma. Story 23. My father passed away when I was 7 years old, shortly after a bitter and contentious divorce from my mother. We never attended his funeral. To this day, I'm 36 now, I've never even visited his grave, though I hope to change that soon. Growing up, my siblings and I were told by my mother that our father didn't want us. She claimed he had sent us away so he could enjoy his life with his new wife and baby son, our stepbrother. I hated him for decades, believing he had cruelly abandoned us to live in poverty and endure the abuse of our mother. My mom would tell us stories about how he'd leave us outside in the cold if we misbehaved, and how he only fed us scraps like a single hot dog or a small can of beans for the 3 of us, while giving his other son the best food and toys. I couldn't remember any of it, so I believed her. Ironically, while accusing him of abuse, she would leave us alone for months at a time, beat us with tree branches, or tell us we were her biggest regret. Thank God for my older sister. Without her, I don't think I would have survived. 5 years ago, while planning my wedding, I decided to reconnect with my little brother, my dad's youngest child. I found him on Facebook and we reconciled. None of what happened was his fault. He was just a baby. When he visited us, we talked about our father, whom we all thought was abusive. My brother, however, seemed genuinely confused by what we were saying. It turns out the truth was very different. After the divorce, my mom manipulated the legal system by seducing a high-powered lawyer to sue for full custody of us. My dad, a poor Southern man, couldn't afford to fight back. We discovered that not only was everything we'd been told about our father a lie, but he had fought tirelessly until the day he died to see us or get us back. We didn't attend his funeral because my mom claimed he didn't want us there. She told us it was written in his will, which was absurd. He died suddenly of a heart attack and never had time to write such a will. We later learned he had sent us letters, gifts, and voicemails, all of which my mom intercepted and destroyed. My stepmother, a kind and wonderful woman, kept court documents, letters, photos, and home videos, proof of his love and devotion to us, in the hope that one day we would learn the truth. Sometimes I think about what must have gone through his mind as he died. Did he think about us? Did he feel like he failed us? Did the stress of losing us contribute to his early death? I feel so guilty knowing the lies I believed about him. If he knew what we thought of him, I think it would have broken his heart. It feels good to know he loved us. But it doesn't change the fact that I can't talk to him now. I can't ask for advice, share my problems, or feel his hug. It's the same emptiness I've always felt, and I think that's the saddest part. I don't know if there's a heaven or an afterlife, but I hope that somehow he knows I'm sorry for believing those lies. I'd give anything to talk to him, even for just a moment, or to feel what his hug was like. Story 24. Last week, I was talking with my dad and stepmom and finally revealed how I hacked, their words not mine, the family computer password when I was a teenager. They used to lock the computer while they were at work, but as a teenager, I wanted to browse MySpace and Facebook instead of doing schoolwork. So they put a password on it. Unfortunately for them, their passwords were incredibly weak. It was usually something like my dad's first initial and last name, which is also mine since I'm a junior. I figured that out easily. When they changed it to something like my stepmom's and dad's initials, I still cracked it. Then they capitalized the initials, but even that wasn't enough. Finally, my grandpa suggested they use a USB device that locked the PC when it wasn't plugged in. That was a bit more of a challenge, but I figured out how to bypass it. There was a 30-second window of inactivity after a restart. So I'd restart the computer, press CTRL plus ALT plus DL to open the task manager, and kill the locking program right as it was about to start. When I finished using the computer, I'd restart it so the lock would work as usual. They knew I was somehow getting in, but couldn't figure out how, and never asked me. They just assumed I was hacking. Ironically, if they'd just asked, I would have told them. Now, 13 years later, while visiting them and my grandma, they brought up how I used to hack into their computer. I finally broke the news that it wasn't hacking. It was weak passwords and a basic understanding of Windows programs. Funny enough, I'm now studying cybersecurity and hope to work in penetration testing someday. Story 25. When I was 13, my two older sisters and I flew to our hometown to visit our mom and extended family. We started by staying at our aunt's house for a few days, which was fine at first. Then, out of the blue, our cousin showed up to stay with us too. At first it was okay. We caught up reluctantly with her while enjoying time with our aunt and uncle. One day, we all decided to walk to a park nearby. That's when my sisters and cousins started talking about smoking weed and wishing they had some. I wasn't interested and didn't think they'd actually get any. But my cousin claimed she had friends who could hook them up. Later that evening after dinner, the house alarm blared. It turned out my cousin had asked a friend to bring weed and pass it through a window. What she didn't realize was that the window was wired to the alarm system. My uncle stormed in, furious. The rest of the night was tense, and we were sent to bed early. The next morning, while my sisters and I made breakfast, our aunt was in a private discussion with my uncle and cousin. When she emerged, she told us we couldn't stay at her house anymore. She had already called our mom to pick us up, saying she didn't want anything happening while she was at work. We were upset and confused about why we were being kicked out. Drama unfolded as the family heard different rumors, but the only explanation we got was that she didn't want accidents happening. Years later, I found out the truth. My cousin told our aunt that my sisters and I had tried to sell our bodies for cigarettes at the park and planned to sneak out that night to do it again. My aunt believed her. To this day, it hurts to think about how unfairly we were treated and how someone I admired could believe such a terrible lie. I don't talk to that side of the family anymore. And as for my cousin, I have nothing to say to her. Story 26. When I was a kid, we didn't hear much about our family's history in Louisiana. My grandmother was one of 11 children, and they grew up on a sugarcane farm before moving to Tulsa during the Great Depression. That's all I knew. A few years ago, during a family gathering, my aunt and I got into an argument about removing Confederate monuments. She pulled me aside and shared a family story she thought would change my perspective. She revealed that one of our great-great-grandfathers was the son of a Confederate soldier who had defected, been captured, and later released. When he returned home, he was tried and hanged for desertion. This left his sick wife and their wet nurse, a black enslaved woman, to care for their children. After the war, his wife passed away, but the wet nurse stayed with the family and raised the children into adulthood. My aunt used this story to argue that slavery in the South was a mutually decent arrangement, saying our family only survived because of the care of a black woman they supposedly saw as a second mother. I wince every time I think about that conversation. It wasn't just the story, but the way my aunt told it, completely blind to the privilege and power dynamics she was describing. That conversation opened my eyes to the deep undercurrent of racism and mythology in American family histories. While painful to confront, I'm grateful to see the truth more clearly now. Story 27. This might seem silly, but my family kept it a secret for years, particularly from the younger generation, and I didn't even find out the full story until after my great-uncle passed away. My grandfather's brother, Uncle Dan as we called him, was both gay and a huge pothead. I know it doesn't sound like a big deal now, but back in the day, my family treated it as a huge scandal. Uncle Dan was an amazing guy. He loved cars, even worked for an auto manufacturer, baseball, and gardening, both the regular kind and the fun kind. He would help us with car troubles, buy the family tickets to minor league baseball games, and give us zoo season passes every Christmas. He was always kind, loved the kids in the family, and even helped take care of them. He had been married for a few years and had one son, but the marriage didn't work out, for obvious reasons. Once his son was grown, Uncle Dan moved in with his mom, my great-grandmother, to care for her when she became too old to live alone. They lived together for years until she passed at 89. Tragically, Uncle Dan died from cancer just 3 months later. I found out about his pothead side as a teenager, but we never smoked together, unfortunately. After he passed, my mom finally told me he was gay. It made me sad to realize that he couldn't fully live as himself while he was alive. Even though my family never treated him badly, they still made him feel like he had to hide who he was. I wish I had known while he was still here so I could have told him that I loved and accepted him for who he was. But life doesn't always work that way. Wherever he is, I hope Uncle Dan is living his best life in a weed garden, happy and free. Story 28. My brother and I always suspected our dad wasn't our biological father. Our parents brushed it off, and by our late teens, we let it go. Over 20 years later, I got a friend request from a woman in Texas. At the time, I was a small YouTube craft personality, so I figured she followed my tutorials and accepted her request. The next day, she messaged me and explained that her stepfather was my biological father, and my brother's too. Her story checked out, and when I saw a picture of him, I knew she was telling the truth. For a year and a half, I didn't tell anyone in my family. I couldn't look my parents or relatives in the eye because it turned out they all knew and had kept it a secret. It turns out my mom was briefly married to this man, divorcing him a year after I was born. She met my dad, or possibly reconnected with him, married him 6 months later, and he raised us. When I finally decided to tell my family, I planned a trip to meet my biological father and went to my parents' house for dinner to break the news. My dad reacted angrily, saying I had stabbed my mom in the back. I expected the reaction and didn't take it personally. My mom convinced me to cancel the trip and rebook it with my brother, which I did. Unfortunately, my brother didn't take the news well and lashed out, accusing me of betraying him by keeping it a secret. A few years later, he took his own life. He had struggled with insecurity and anger, and I still feel guilty for how things unfolded. It's been over 10 years and I still haven't met my biological father. Maybe one day. Story 29. Thanks to an ancestry DNA test, I discovered I almost dated my half-brother. Growing up, my parents were very social and often hosted parties. One of their friend groups included a southern rock band whose kids we grew up with. When I was 16, one of the older boys, John Smith, caught my eye. He was 19 and very handsome. After my boyfriend cheated on me, I asked John to take me to a school dance to make my ex jealous. My mom was hesitant, saying John was too old, smoked, and was a bad influence. But we went anyway. Nothing romantic happened. It felt more like going with a childhood friend. Fast forward to Christmas 2019. My husband bought me a DNA test. When the results came back, none of my dad's family members showed up. Instead, I saw a list of Smiths, including one listed as a half-sibling. It turned out my mom had cheated on my dad with members of the band, one of whom was my biological father. My aunt confirmed it, saying my parents had both struggled with infidelity and drug problems when they were younger. I was furious. My mom passed away when I was 18, and I grew up feeling unloved by my dad. No one thought to tell me the truth. I've since learned I have 6 additional siblings on my biological father's side. Ironically, I attended my biological father's funeral a year before this revelation, out of respect for John Smith, who remains a close friend. Looking back, I'm so grateful nothing happened romantically with John. It could have been a nightmare. And as for my family, let's just say I have no patience for secrets anymore. Story 30. When I was in high school, my mom, dad, and younger brother visited my mom's family at our vacation condo a few hours away. I couldn't go because I had to work my summer job, and I was pretty bummed about it. Apparently, one night, an argument broke out between my mom and her younger sister. My aunt was a surprise baby, born while my mom was in college, and grew up during a time when my grandparents' investments had finally paid off. This meant my aunt had a more privileged and comfortable childhood than my mom, which led to a lot of resentment. The fight started over something mundane, like cleaning up after dinner, but escalated quickly. My aunt called my mom a fat, jealous bitch, to which my mom replied, "I may be fat, but I'm not jealous. I'm not the one who is messing around with Grandpa's business partner." Turns out my aunt had an affair with one of my grandfather's close business partners. My mom even babysat for her one night when my aunt went to meet him. After that explosive revelation, I got a call from my brother saying they were heading home early. The fallout was terrible. Most of our extended family sided with my aunt and turned on my mom. To this day, it blows my mind that I missed all that drama. Story 31. In the early 1980s, my family abandoned my aunt when she was just 20 years old. She had a severe mental disability, and they sent her to a state-run mental institution in the South, where no one ever visited her until she passed away last year. It was similar to the story of the Kennedys, but sadly more recent. She couldn't speak well and had limited language skills, but could recognize and acknowledge people. Despite this, my relatives never checked on her, and I can only imagine the conditions she endured without anyone advocating for her. I only learned about her when she passed and asked an older aunt for more details. The most ironic part: my family has always donated to and supported charities for intellectual and developmental disabilities. It became clear that their involvement was more for appearances than genuine care. Story 32. I grew up without a father, as did my 4 siblings. My younger brother had a different dad who was never around, and the man I thought was my dad lived down the street. He would drive by with his new wife or girlfriend, and I would wave excitedly, telling my friends, "There goes my dad," without understanding why he never stopped. At 23, I heard a rumor from my aunt that my real dad was looking for me. I brushed it off, thinking she was just trying to cause drama. Years later, at 37, I got home from work, grabbed a beer, and told my wife I needed some alone time. Then the phone rang, and the caller ID showed the name of the man my aunt had mentioned years ago. I froze. My wife answered and told me it was my dad. I took the call, and he spoke quickly, likely afraid I'd hang up. He told me he'd been looking for me since I was 23, but had stopped after someone told him I didn't want anything to do with him. No one knew who gave him that misinformation, but it stole years from us. Eventually, I confirmed with my mom and siblings that he was my real dad, and no one denied it. The man I thought was my father was not. Everyone had kept this secret from me my entire life. Thankfully, I spent 9 wonderful years building a relationship with my dad before COVID took him in January. While I regret the years we lost, I'm grateful for the time we had. Story 33. A few years ago, my mom, who was obsessed with researching our family tree, bought 23andMe kits for me and my fiancé as Christmas gifts. When I got my results, a name popped up that I didn't recognize. We shared a significant amount of DNA, so I showed it to my mom, but she didn't recognize the name either. Since I was no longer in contact with my dad at the time, I reached out to the woman directly. After days of back and forth, we found a name we both recognized: my grandmother. It turned out that my grandmother had an affair with this woman's father a month before he married her mother. The woman was my biological aunt and lived just a few hours away. This revelation made so much of my childhood make sense. My grandmother had always been particularly cruel to me, even though I was the only one in my generation who avoided trouble and achieved success. Looking back, I realize it was likely because I reminded her of her infidelity. As for my fiancé, His 23andMe test helped him reconnect with his biological mother, father, and brother, which was a positive and healing experience for him. Story 34. After reading through similar stories, I've realized that those dramatic soap operas on TV aren't as far-fetched as they seem. Sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction. When I was 16, I started piecing together the truth about where my life began. I had seen a framed picture of my parents' marriage certificate and did the math. It didn't add up. As I grew older, I noticed my mom was extremely strict with me. She didn't allow me to go out unsupervised, be around boys, or stay out after dark. While my parents were strict with all of us, it was particularly intense with me. One day, standing in my bedroom doorway, I confronted my mom. I pointed out that she was pregnant when she married my dad and said something along the lines of, "That's why you hate me so much." The look on her face was one of utter shock. She hadn't expected me to uncover the family secret, and in that moment, she didn't know what to say. Looking back, it explained so much. My mom had always treated me differently than my siblings. She was hard on me, often rejecting me, and never told me she loved me. She acted as if I owed her something, and if anyone else showed me kindness, she would get jealous. Any small ray of happiness I found was quickly taken away. Despite getting good grades, staying out of trouble, and taking care of my siblings and the household, I felt I could never earn her love. That lack of love led to emotional struggles and eating disorders during my teenage years. I didn't know what a healthy family dynamic looked like, and anytime I spoke up about the dysfunction in our home, I was silenced through abuse. At 15, my parents began to separate, and I was sent to live with my maternal grandmother. It turned out to be a blessing. For the first time, I experienced unconditional love and acceptance. My grandmother treated me like I mattered, and her care provided a foundation for me to rebuild myself as I grew older. Later, I learned the full story. My mom had been a teenager in the 1960s when she went out with my dad. On one date, he parked at Griffith Park in Los Angeles. My mom, who was very inexperienced, claimed she felt pressured into intimacy that night. She became pregnant, which caused a massive uproar in her family. Her mother, ashamed and embarrassed, threw her out of the house. My mom, only 17, had to move in with my dad's family, who also weren't thrilled with the situation. The resentment from this experience stayed with her, and she never sought therapy to heal. Years later, my parents' marriage was strained. My dad had his own issues, likely neurological or developmental, which made him struggle with boundaries and appropriateness. His behavior caused scandals and even more pain for the family. He is now on his 5th marriage, trying to settle down in his later years. My mom, on the other hand, has mellowed out somewhat and acknowledges some of her mistakes, though much damage remains. Ironically, a best-selling teen novel written by someone who knew my brother in grade school is partially based on the trauma of our childhood. My brother, who is my closest sibling, has faced more trauma than most people I know. Yet he carries that into his own family despite being a wonderful, kind person. He's sober now, but his children still deal with the effects of growing up in a home affected by addiction. Through all of this, I've learned an important lesson. While it's easy to blame the bad guy in our stories, the real challenge is to break the cycle. Healing and restoration are what truly matter. Story 35. When I was in 7th grade, I had to do a report on my ancestry and needed to look at my mom's birth certificate. I noticed her maiden name was different from what I expected and asked her about it. She made me promise not to tell my grandfather because it would break his heart. It turns out my mom's biological father had proposed to my grandmother, but she turned him down due to her struggles with addiction and mental health. My grandfather met my mom when she was just a little girl and decided to marry my grandmother to give her stability and a father figure. In 2011, when my mom was in a coma, dying of cancer, my grandfather broke down and told me with tears in his eyes that he married my grandmother because my mom needed a dad. It was the only time he ever mentioned that he wasn't her biological father. After he passed in 2020, it came up in conversation, and neither of my mom's sisters had ever known. Despite everything, my grandfather was the one who took care of my mom throughout her life. When she passed, the responsibility fell to me as her sisters wouldn't be bothered. I gladly took care of him because he was more of a father to me than my biological dad ever was. He taught me what real love looks like. Story 36. My dad once told me that I was supposed to have a younger brother, but my mom miscarried when I was 2 years old, and my sister was 4. My mom never wanted us to find out. 2 years later, they had another daughter, but my mom apparently wanted to take the miscarriage secret to her grave. I only found out recently when my dad visited my daughter for the first time. My parents divorced 20 years ago, and my dad wasn't able to visit because of his late wife's health issues. After she passed, he could finally come see us, and he shared this secret with me. My mom still doesn't know that I know, and my two sisters have no idea. I also learned another family secret during this visit. My great-grandfather was murdered while working on the railroads in Chicago during the Great Depression. The police refused to investigate because my family were immigrants. We'll never know who did it, only that someone targeted him for his relative wealth and background. Story 37. While my grandfather was fighting in the war, my grandmother had a secret relationship with a Chinese man. She became pregnant with him between the births of my dad and aunt. She somehow hid her pregnancy from everyone, including her family. When she went into labor, she drove herself 6 hours to the nearest city and gave birth in secret. The baby was born with minor disabilities, and my grandmother left her at the hospital, where she was eventually adopted by a wealthy family. When the child was 50, she reached out to my grandmother, but my grandmother denied everything and acted shocked. After my grandmother passed away 2 years ago, the truth came out through birth certificates and documents. My dad and aunt were stunned to learn they had a half-sister they never knew about. Story 38. My brother, who's adopted, decided to search for his biological family after having kids. He wanted to know about his genetic health history. He discovered a letter from his biological parents saying they loved him, but weren't ready for kids at the time as they were in college. It turns out his biological parents stayed together, got married, and had 3 more children, making them his full siblings. He met his biological dad for coffee, but his dad asked him not to contact them again, saying his wife had a hard time with the adoption decision and would be distraught if they reconnected. It broke my brother's heart, especially because his siblings don't know about him, and he has so much in common with his biological family, shared interests in sports, education, and even appearance. It's painful knowing he can't build a relationship with them, but he treasures the small connection he did make. Story 39. After being injured by a blast in combat, I developed a seizure disorder. Despite no family history of seizures, doctors asked me to investigate my genetic background. I had cut ties with my abusive birth family years ago, especially after my severely autistic sister died due to a suspicious overdose. No investigation was done because of her disability, and my last tie to my birth family was severed. Through 23andMe and Ancestry.com, I discovered that I had many connections to my birth mother's maiden name, but none to my birth father's last name. I reached out to an aunt who spilled the truth. My birth grandfather was sterile. My grandmother had an affair with a neighbor's husband to conceive my father. The truth caused a massive scandal back then, as the neighbor's children looked strikingly similar to my father. The families moved away, but I later met one of the neighbor's sons who confirmed the story. Tragically, shortly after we connected, he took his own life, leaving me without further answers about my genetic history. This experience left me questioning how many of us really know the full truth about our ancestry. Story 40. My uncle wasn't a good person in the conventional sense, but he loved me and my cousins more than anything. He was a heroin addict, and we often smoked pot together. At one point, when he was homeless, he built a home by welding 3 single-room campers and a school bus together. He installed a wood-burning stove to keep warm during the cold Ohio winters. My aunt, who was his ex-wife and also my guardian at the time, allowed me to stay with him for a few nights when I was 15. My uncle had a pig living outside in a pen, and he dug a pit to roast it. One evening, while we were playing cards, an older man, Kenny, stopped by. Kenny gave me an uneasy, predatory vibe. Over the next few days, Kenny came over frequently. We played cards, smoked, and hung out. But something always felt off. One night, while I was chopping wood outside, Kenny told me he loved hanging out with me. The way he said it made me feel deeply uncomfortable. A few nights later, I woke up to find the fire in the stove had gone out. I went to the shed for more wood and thought I saw a man in the woods. I told my uncle, but when he checked, he found no one. One evening, while my uncle was in town, Kenny showed up uninvited. He helped me chop wood, but his gaze made me uneasy. When we went inside, Kenny tried to take advantage of me. Just then, my uncle came home, saw what was happening, and dragged Kenny outside. I sat in the corner, crying, while I heard yelling and fighting. Hours later, my uncle came back inside, covered in dirt, and told me I wouldn't have to worry about Kenny ever again. Story 41. My grandpa always bragged about putting his son through college, which my dad resented. My dad had worked his way through school with ROTC and Eagle Scout scholarships, plus a janitor job at his fraternity house for room and board. 40 years later, at my cousin's wedding reception, my great-aunt mentioned that a woman named LaTroya had passed away. When one of the cousins asked why she called her that, she explained it meant the whore in Italian. Long story short, this woman had been my grandfather's teenage sweetheart. Her father wouldn't let her marry my grandpa because he was a middle school dropout, so she married a well-educated mobster instead. Years later, her mobster husband, who was infertile, was mysteriously shot. The woman moved back to town living with her parents, and a few months later she had a baby boy. My grandfather always worked 2 full-time jobs and flipped houses on weekends, yet he didn't leave much when he died. Curious, I Googled the widow's son, whose name I found in her obituary. He had attended the University of Michigan in law school, achieving great success. I'm pretty sure I figured out which son my grandpa actually put through college. Story 42. Growing up, we all thought my grandmother, Gram, was just mean. She constantly complained about her stepmother and half-sister, which we dismissed as exaggeration. Years after she passed away, my mom found a stack of letters and a cassette tape while packing to move. These revealed the truth about how cruel Gram's stepmother and half-sister had been. After Gram's mother died, her father remarried and essentially left her in the care of her stepmother, who sent Gram to a Catholic orphanage for schooling. She rarely saw her father. When Gram's husband, my grandfather, left to fight in WW2, her stepmother and half-sister sent her a "with deepest sympathy" card. On the back, there was a cruel letter calling her worthless trash and saying she should accept her life was over. When her half-sister got married, she sent Gram an invitation, but included a handwritten note saying she wasn't allowed to attend. The real reason for the invitation was to make their father believe Gram was ungrateful for not sending a gift. The cassette revealed more manipulation. Gram had recorded a conversation in which her half-sister lied to their elderly father, claiming Gram had confused him into sitting outside in the cold for hours. After their father's death, the stepmother and half-sister contested his will, claiming Gram had been a terrible daughter and convinced a lawyer to expunge it. Gram lost about $500,000 in inheritance. This newfound information made us realize Gram wasn't exaggerating. She truly endured a lifetime of mistreatment from her own family. Story 44. This is a difficult story, and I'm still processing it to this day. My first niece, who was older than me in our Asian family dynamic, this isn't unusual, tragically took her life in 2017. She had been battling CPTSD, severe depression, and schizophrenia. After her passing, my older siblings finally revealed the truth about what she had endured. When she was younger, some older cousins had abused her. She carried this secret for most of her life. Prior to learning this, I had no idea why our extended family had grown apart, as we had always been very close. During times when my niece was struggling, my family often took her in. It was during one of these stays that she confided in my siblings about her trauma. This happened around the rise of the #MeToo movement, and I later learned that my sister was also a victim of the same group of cousins. There are likely more victims who have not yet come forward. Before her passing, my niece confronted her abusers at a family gathering. They denied everything, dismissing her and calling her crazy. When my sister came forward, she faced the same response. These denials caused my niece to distance herself from our extended family, which deepened her isolation and worsened her mental health. I believe this played a role in the development of her schizophrenia and her eventual decision to take her own life. What makes it even harder is that she had been making progress. She started taking medication, exercising, had a job, and even found a boyfriend. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, she ended her life. Her funeral was heartbreakingly silent. Many of us felt that the abusers bore some responsibility for her death, but they refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Since then, my family has cut ties with that side of the family. The revelation has disrupted our entire family dynamic. My parents rarely see her siblings because of what their children did to my parents' daughter. This loss wasn't just about my niece, it also felt like the loss of our larger family. I've noticed my mom's depression has worsened over the years, and the grieving process has been long and difficult for all of us. I was never supposed to know the full story, as I was still a child when it happened. But the day she passed, emotions spilled over, and the truth came out. It shattered my idea of what family meant. Before this, I believed family was everything. Summers and holidays were spent with our larger family, but that doesn't happen anymore. As I've grown older, I've noticed that our circle has become much smaller. The families of the abusers have chosen to side with their relatives, claiming none of it ever happened. However, I know for a fact that one of them apologized to my niece before her death. He had a daughter of his own and felt immense guilt. Surprisingly, my niece accepted his apology, facilitated by my sister and her husband who were close to him. But when his siblings found out, they ridiculed our family for letting the secret out because they had sworn to keep it hidden. The fallout was messy, and it still is. I don't think they'll ever forgive us for speaking the truth because they care more about protecting their image than facing the consequences. This tension has even affected the younger generation. Although we aren't responsible for what happened, there's an awkwardness between us. Our parents don't encourage us to spend time together because of their disdain for one another's families, even though we grew up as close cousins. My sister continues to deal with her trauma and has been diagnosed with CPTSD. It's been incredibly difficult for her, and watching her struggle has been heartbreaking. I'm not sure where this post is going, but I needed to let these emotions out. The grief, the loss, and the fractured family, it's all still so hard to process. Story 45. A few years ago, I decided to try Ancestry.com and managed to trace my family tree back to Louis Hebert, the first European apothecary to arrive in Acadia with Samuel Champlain. When I shared this with my grandmother, she surprised me by admitting that half of our family tree might not even be accurate. She explained that her mother, my great-grandmother, had been ostracized by the family. She was kicked out or ran away at 16 after alleging she had been assaulted. She never shared much detail about it. My great-grandparents married just days before my grandmother was born. However, my great-grandmother's birth certificate wasn't recorded until 1936, 2 years after my grandmother's birth. We pieced together that my great-grandmother's birth likely caused her own mother's death, which happened within the same month. This led her father to resent her. Alternatively, she may have been the product of an affair compounding her father's anger. He remarried, and her stepmother treated her poorly. Around age 17, she experienced another assault. Shortly after, she married a man she was dating at the time, and they went on to have 13 children together. Because of the gaps and coincidences in the timeline, there's a strong chance that my great-grandfather, and even my great-great-grandfather, aren't biologically related to us. This throws the supposed distinguished lineage into question. Looking back, there are so many oddities in the family tree. It's made me question just how much of it is rooted in fact. Story 46. My great-uncle's story was one of shame and silence in my family. He was killed by neighbors during the epuration, post-WW2 purges, at just 17 years old. My grandmother rarely spoke of him. It was too painful. All we knew was that he had been labeled a collaborator who worked with a local group aiding the Gestapo. The family instead celebrated his brother, who was a war hero. Last year, my father decided to investigate the truth. What we uncovered changed everything. At 15, my great-uncle joined the collaborator group out of ignorance and youthful naivety. However, he quickly realized he had made a terrible mistake. He approached a resistance group from another region, asking to join their fight against the Nazis. The resistance agreed to take him in, but asked him to remain in the collaborator group as a spy. For nearly 2 years, he provided intelligence to the resistance, even helping Gestapo prisoners, fellow resistance members, and Jewish individuals escape. When the war ended, the epuration began, a chaotic time when accusations of collaboration were often based on little to no evidence. It was also an opportunity for some to settle personal vendettas. My great-uncle's neighbors accused him of being a collaborator and refused to believe his claims that he had been spying for the resistance. They didn't investigate or contact the resistance group to verify his story. Instead, they locked him in a barn, tortured him for 3 days, and then killed him, burying his body in the woods. We found a photo of my grandmother, her sister, and their mother at the makeshift grave, crying. An investigator also uncovered a letter my great-uncle wrote to his mother shortly before his death. In the letter, he explained that he had a very quick trial and would be executed that day. He repeatedly apologized for the pain his death would cause her and asked her to be kind to the barn owner, who wasn't involved. His handwriting became shakier and more panicked as the letter went on. My great-grandmother never saw the letter. She passed away before it was found. Although my grandmother still owns the house in that village, she never visits. The memories are too painful, and she harbors deep resentment toward the neighbors, many of whom are still alive. Due to a law passed by Charles de Gaulle, all post-war violence during the purges was pardoned, meaning the neighbors could never be held accountable. With the documents proving my great-uncle's role in the resistance, my grandmother finally moved his portrait from a small, hidden room to a place of honor in the living room.